Hi everyone, today we're going to be looking at Metal Ursa's Fokker DR-1. Now this is known as Red Baron's triplane that was flown during the World War I. So if you look at the back of the package, it actually says that it's a medium difficulty, which I agree with. And I will show later on where the difficulty was. As always, I'm going to be using a wire snipper to remove the metal pieces from the sheet. The metal sheets are designed in a way where there will be a little bit of a gap in between where the tabs are connected, just enough for a wire snipper to get in between so that you can snip it off pretty easily. Part of the difficulty of this model is all the really small parts, and as you can see here, this is the cockpit seat that is actually just one single piece. But it requires the curvature, but also the white part on the top. You actually have to rotate 180 degrees, then fold it down 90 degrees, and then bend it in between the seats. And what that is the actual safety belt. But as I was doing that, I actually did break off that white tab, because when you do big rotations like 180 degrees, it does tend to snap or kind of get torn. And so what I actually had to do was actually use super glue to kind of glue it back in and kind of create like a hidden joint. So one thing about the design that was interesting was that you have the motors where you're actually bringing a lot of these small pieces in that are kind of like the cylinders of the engine, except that half of it's going to be covered by a plate that you're never going to see, and it's kind of interesting that make you actually build out all the pieces of this engine when you're only going to see a part of it. So I love the detail, except that I kind of thought that a lot of the pieces were not necessary just because you will never really see it. So as you can see here with this front plate, you're actually covering half of those cylinder shapes that you've actually attached on, and you're actually not going to see it. Even from the bottom side, you're only going to see up to half of those cylinders. There are a lot of curvatures on this plane, but what I actually ended up doing, instead of using a tool to actually bend a lot of these pieces, I ended up just using my fingers and just applying gentle pressure, or I'd be actually pressing against the desk and slightly putting pressure on it so that it kind of bends. And what that actually helps do is apply even enough pressure along the whole face so that instead of getting little bumps here and there when you're bending stuff, you're actually getting like an even curvature bend by using your fingers or using the desk as a leverage. I would use a tweezer a lot of times to bend the tab 90 degrees, especially because you want to be able to bend the tab instead of twisting it when it's on the exterior side, just so that it kind of has a clean look. And the tabs are actually colored too, so that once you bend it, it kind of just blends in with the rest of the plane. So the wings are the part that attach to the body that actually requires a lot of finesse, because you want to make sure all the tabs meet the right places. So I realized that I made a mistake later on in the build where the wing was actually on backwards. The color side is supposed to be facing downwards, because afterwards you're going to be putting the top plate of the wing over it. So just make sure to look at the manual carefully, because they do alert you when you want to put the engraved side on the bottom or on the top. So just moving forward, just assume that that wing is actually reversed and you're actually seeing the color side on the bottom. So this model was interesting to me because this is one of the first models where I had two things happen. So the first thing was that this is my first model where I actually bend the tab over a piece instead of inserting it through a hole and twisting or bending it. And this is just to make sure that it kind of lines up and kind of holds it in place. But it's kind of different from the other ones where they want to make sure that it's kind of secured together so that it's held together or joined together. And the other thing that was unique about this model for me is that the rear wing is actually bended down, so that you're actually having one single piece where you bend it in half, and that actually gives you the finish for the top and the bottom side from one piece. A tip for the structural piece that is supposed to be attached to the wings is that because it's a small piece, if you're actually using the plier to bend the metal piece, what actually happens is that the adjacent side, because it's so thin, actually starts warping also. So what I actually do is use the plier to hold the one side to make it rigid and stiff, and then I'll actually use my finger to bend the opposite side down across the plier, and this actually allows me to have two flat surfaces when bent 90 degrees. I wanted to call out this confusion on the manual because if you look at the top of the structure, how it's attached, it looks like they're supposed to be kind of rotated opposite of each other. But when I looked at it more closely, they are supposed to be parallel when you attach them. It's just that the manual, I guess because the isometric angle, it made it look very confusing where it looked like I had to rotate one of the pieces 180 degrees. But in reality, they should be parallel to each other. I didn't bend this piece ahead of time, so I'm actually putting my needle nose plier in and kind of stretching it out and bending it, but you should really bend it before attaching it to the bottom of the wing. Another thing to note is that the belly of this plane should actually be a little bit wider because you're going to actually have a plate that's going to be attaching it to the bottom side, and I struggled with this later on when trying to attach all the tabs, so just be aware that it doesn't have to be very tight on the bottom. I like using my fingers to sometimes make curvatures just because it's more tactile, and I'm actually better at applying even pressure and kind of fixing the curvature along by using my fingers. For this piece, I actually used the back of my X-Acto knife to actually have the piece bend around and over because you actually need a small gap in between the bend of the two pieces so they can actually fit through the tabs when you're attaching it to the wing. So an interesting thing about the triplane is when I took a class for the history of aeronautics back in college, I remember that this triplane was actually kind of a tribute to the higher kill counts of the German side, just because the triplane is actually more maneuverable than the biplanes that the Allies were using, which allowed for them to be able to be more dangerous in combat. Even though it was a slower airplane, they actually, since they can actually dodge and actually move around better, it actually became a more superior plane technology-wise versus the biplanes that the Allies were using. Another thing that I found very fascinating about these planes during the World War era were that the guns were always located behind the propellers. And you know, when you watch the cartoons, you always see the scene where they're shooting the gun through the propellers, and so when they keep shooting it through, they're actually cutting off or shooting out the propellers, which I thought was really interesting how it would actually work. But when looking into it, it's actually that the gun was synced to the rotation of the propeller so that it would only fire at certain frames, I guess you could say, or rotations, that it will actually always go through or between the propellers, so you're not actually hitting the propellers when you're shooting. I've said this a couple times before in my other build videos, but I really do hate these small pieces just because since they're so small and I have stubby short fingers, my fingers really do hurt when working with these pieces. And I'm just glad that I do have a round tip plier, because the round tip pliers really did save me a lot of time with these curvatures that are really small. Considering that this is just a 2-sheet model, it actually did take a lot longer than expected just because of all the really small parts and intricacy and the curvatures, so this ended up being a longer build than I anticipated. So there are certain parts of the build or certain I guess sequences where I would end up spending at least 30 minutes to an hour just for one step, just because it was really hard to get it just right. So this is how I do my bend sometimes, is I actually just use the table as leverage to be able to apply gentle pressure and even pressure along the face so that it becomes an even curvature. I've actually moved away from using my round plier in later builds for these curvatures or these circles, because I actually got these metal rods from Amazon that have different diameters, so then I can always just find the right diameter and just wrap the metal piece around the rod so that I can get an even circular shape. Same for any cone shapes. There are tools out there that have different diameters for the cone, so that you can actually just wrap the metal piece around the cone edge to get a perfect cone. There's a YouTuber named Animate Orange, and he actually has a website that he sells a custom 3D printed cone shaper for the Metal Earth series, or actually any sheet metal model actually. So look them up on Google, or actually look them up on YouTube, and you can actually see his page. But I actually purchased some of his tools, and they're pretty great. One suggestion would be that because it is 3D printed, you do not have like a smooth edge, so you might want to use like a little bit of a sandpaper to kind of just grind it down just to make it a smooth edge, so that it kind of wraps a little easier. I do have to say, I'm not a big fan of pieces that have like these long pieces just sticking out perpendicular, because it becomes really awkward to handle, and so you want to be really careful so that you're not accidentally pressing against the side or something and actually bending it, or even in the worst case scenario snapping it off. So this is the piece that took the longest time to attach, and as you can see, you're putting the bottom half and the top half together, and from there you see that the bottom plate sheet has to go through a bunch of these tabs, and it's actually hard to get all of them in together, and I actually cut out a lot of the edit, but it took about 45 minutes of footage that I cut out to show this process. But what I've been doing was just starting with one tab on one side, just kind of adjusting the sheet as I go along. So instead of trying to get all the tabs in all at once, which is just going to be almost impossible, it's easier to just start from one corner and start making your way through each tab in like a circular rotation or motion, and just make sure you get all the tabs in eventually. And I know this video is under about 15 minutes, but the build time was actually pretty long, and the only reason these videos are short is because I didn't know if people would want to actually see like a longer video with more details about how the builds were. But I didn't want to do a time lapse where it's just super sped up at like 400 or 800 speed. I thought I still wanted to show like each step of the process, so what I did was a lot of edits in the videos just to show the important parts. But what that does is skip any of the parts that took a lot longer to build, just because I felt like the video was dragging on. But if you actually want to see the longer videos or full build videos, just let me know, and maybe I'll start making the videos longer just so that I can kind of show more detail, or you can even see me struggle making these models. For the last part is the propeller, and what you're doing is actually bending the sheets in half so that you're going to actually have a double-sided propeller, and then you're actually going to be bending the propellers to a slight angle so that it's actually not flat, but kind of not curved, but kind of angled at how a normal propeller would look. And we're going to be attaching the last piece, which is the propeller, which will finish our model, which is the Fokker DR1. I have to say I really did enjoy this model and building it. It was challenging enough, and there were a lot of great details, and it's actually my first airplane model that I've done, and I actually have a few more that I want to do, so please look out for those videos. And here are some final images that I took of the DR1, and I think it just turned out really great. A lot of details. I love the color, and I actually love the matte finish of their model, just because I actually don't like the glossy look, because I feel like the glossy look actually looks cheap. And here are some close-up images, and as you can see, it looks great even when it's close up. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed watching this video, please hit that subscribe button, and and also hit the bell or the notification if you want to get notified when I make new videos and I upload them.